Welcome, curious minds, to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a question that might just flip your understanding of history and maybe even your assumptions about modern masculinity completely on its head. Why did elite men in ancient Greece seem to have these, well, public boyfriends? And maybe even more fascinating, how did this practice, which seems to have been pretty widely accepted, just sort of get erased from the history books?
It's a truly complex historical phenomenon, and one that, it directly challenges our modern ideas about sexual identity, relationships, even things like friendship.
Right.
The really crucial thing to get hold of right from the start is that ancient societies just didn't categorize sexual identity in the same rigid boxes we use today. Their focus. It was often much more about the roles people played in sexual acts.
Roles, like active or passive.
Exactly, active or passive, and also, crucially, their social status. It wasn't so much about the gender of the partner or a fixed identity like we think of straight or gay. That just wasn't their framework.
Okay, so that's the core of what we're digging into today. Our mission, then, is to trace how these male-male relationships evolved. We'll start with, how common they were in archaic and classical Greece.
Right, when they were quite visible.
Then look at how Roman attitudes, with their very different ideas about masculinity, started to change things. And then the really big shifts, the decisive impact of early Christianity, which fundamentally altered everything socially, legally, forever.
And look, as we get into this, we should probably acknowledge up front, this topic can touch on some sensitive areas for people. Our goal here, as always, is just to report impartially on the historical sources, help you understand the complex ideas in that material.
Absolutely. This isn't about judging or endorsing anything. It's purely about historical understanding. Seeing how drastically different societies could be.
Yeah, how different the past really was.
Okay, let's start unpacking this. When we talk about these public boyfriends in ancient Greece, what we're mostly talking about is something called paiderastia. Paiderastia.
Paiderastia, yeah. It was essentially a socially recognized romantic relationship, often, yes, with a sexual component, and it was specifically between an adult male, he was called the erastes, the older active partner, and an adolescent boy, the eromenos. He was the younger, receptive partner.
And this wasn't some fringe thing.
Not at all. It was an integral part of the social fabric, especially for certain classes.
So the eromenos, what was he like? Typically,
he'd be in his teens. You often see him depicted in art and literature as, slender, elegant, beardless. That lack of a beard was a key visual marker of his youth, his sort of transitional stage.
And crucially, this wasn't seen as like a lifelong orientation.
No, definitely not. It was generally understood as a developmental phase for the younger guy. The relationship was expected to conclude as he matured, grew that beard, got ready for marriage to a woman, took on adult responsibilities.
So it was built into their life cycle in a way that's just profoundly different from how we think about relationships or identity now.
Exactly. It was a social institution, not just a private preference.
That's a vital distinction, isn't it? More than just private desire. It was a significant social institution woven right into their community fabric. Especially for who? Free citizens.
Yeah.
Upper classes.
Primarily, yes. Free citizens of the upper echelons. It played a real functional role. Almost, you could say, a form of social engineering.
How so? Where did it come from?
Well, what's really fascinating is how scholars connect paiderasty to specific origins and functions. Take Crete, for example. There's pretty strong evidence linking it directly to initiation rituals.
Initiation into what?
Into adult male life. Military training, citizenship, religious practices, especially those connected to Zeus. It seems a young man's entry into these spheres often involved a paiderastic relationship. It wasn't just about romance or sex, it was a rite of passage.
Wow. So how did that work on Crete?
Well, the sources describe a kind of ritual abduction. The erastes would take the eromenos away, often to the mountains for a period. There, the youth would be educated, hunting, warfare, city laws. Then they'd return, and the erastes would give the boy specific ceremonial gifts.
Gifts? Like what?
Military gear, an ox symbolizing his step towards adult civic duty, and a drinking cup. It suggests this very functional role in socializing young men, preparing them for their duties as citizens and soldiers.
So it wasn't just about desire, it was purposeful. A pillar of their social structure, designed to create loyal citizens, leaders.
Precisely. And this educational aspect was huge. It tied directly into their system of paideia, education, and character formation. The erastes wasn't just a lover, he was a mentor.
A mentor, okay.
Yeah, he was expected to impart intellectual and moral guidance to his eromenos, alongside, yes, the sensual or erotic aspects. This was a key way cultural values, practical knowledge, civic virtue were passed down. The relationship was supposed to inspire the younger man towards excellence.
It sounds like it was meant to build society, build cohesion.
Indeed, it fostered loyalty, especially among the elite, and prepared young men for their adult roles in the polis, the city-state. And this had military applications too.
Ah, the Sacred Band of Thebes. I was wondering when they'd come up.
The classic example, right? A renowned military unit. 150 pairs of male lovers. 150 pairs.
Wow.
And the belief was that their intense bonds, their love for each other, made them fight harder, more fiercely. You'd fight to protect your beloved right there beside you.
Makes a certain kind of sense, I suppose.
They were considered virtually unbeatable for decades, until, well, Philip II of Macedon finally defeated them at Chaeronea in 338 BCE. And even then, the historian Plutarch recorded that their bodies were found fallen together side by side, a testament to those bonds.
It really makes you think about how social norms shape even something like battlefield courage. The fact these relationships were openly acknowledged, even celebrated sometimes, not hidden away, it just highlights how different their world was.
Completely different. It was a fundamental part of their public life, for many. A source of honor, not shame.
Okay, so let's get into the dynamics a bit more. You mentioned the erastes and eromenos. These roles were clearly defined.
Very clearly. Almost ritualistically, you could say. The erastes. Older, active, dominant. The eromenos, younger, passive, receptive. And this active-passive thing, it wasn't just about sex. No, it lined up with broader social ideas. Dominance versus submission, maturity versus youth. The active role was strongly linked to masculinity, higher status, adulthood. The passive role, linked more with femininity, lower status, youthfulness. This structure was key to why it was socially acceptable.
And there was a whole courtship process.
Oh, yes. Quite an elaborate social code. The eromenos was actually expected to put up some resistance initially, sort of play hard to get. It was a test. It proved the erastes' sincerity, his passion, his worthiness, his honorable intentions. It showed he wasn't just after a quick fling. Only if the erastes showed real dedication, perseverance, would the younger man eventually yield.
And you mentioned those gifts on Crete.
Right, the military gear, the ox, the cup. Formalized gifts. It shows these weren't just casual things, they had a ritual feel, signifying a serious social bond.
Okay, but what about the passive role? Was that always okay? Especially for older men.
That's where it gets complicated. While the eromenos role was accepted for youths as this developmental stage, this temporary thing, there was definitely significant tension around adult men taking the passive role.
Tension how?
Well, sources, especially things like Athenian comedy, often contain insults aimed at adult men perceived as passive or effeminate. Penetrative sex, where an adult free citizen was the passive partner, seems to have been widely considered demeaning. It potentially compromised his status, his virility.
So this public boyfriend model we're talking about, it was pretty specific. Age-gated, role-specific, not just a free-for-all.
Exactly. It wasn't a blanket endorsement of all male-male sex, especially when it involved two mature men or a mature man being passive. The society distinguished very carefully between different types of relationships.
How rigid was that? Did being passive as a youth automatically label you for life?
That's where recent scholarship gets interesting. Some scholars, like David Halperin, argue that while the active-passive structure was important, we shouldn't oversimplify. Just because a young man was an eromenos didn't necessarily mean he was seen as permanently feminine or gay in our modern sense.
So more fluid.
Potentially, yes.
Yep.
The idea is that his role in youth didn't lock him into a fixed adult identity. That fluidity is something easily missed if we just slap our modern categories onto the past.
And you mentioned regional differences too. It wasn't the same everywhere in Greece.
Not at all. Greece wasn't a monolith. Paiderastia was highly institutionalized, really central, in places like Elis and Boeotia, tied right into military and civic training.
In Athens.
Athens had it, of course, famously so in philosophy and art, but maybe didn't embrace the courtship rituals to the same degree as some Dorian states like Sparta or Crete. On Crete, as we said, very early, very institutionalized. They even had things like the dance of naked youths, an armed dance, part of military training, often performed in front of their lovers.
Wow. Any other variations?
Yeah, in the Greek East, it seems an erastes might have had relationships with several eromenoi over time, whereas the Dorian custom typically was said to involve just one eromenos, emphasizing a deeper, more exclusive bond, lots of local flavors.
Okay, this is crucial though. We were talking about relationships between free citizens, right?
Mhm.
How did this compare to sex with, say, slaves or prostitutes?
Very different, a critical distinction. The respected, institutionalized form of paiderastia we've been discussing was primarily for free citizens. It had that social educational purpose. Sex with slaves or visiting male prostitutes, pornoi or hatori, was a separate thing.
How was it viewed?
Generally acceptable for a free man to visit prostitutes, male or female, as long as he remained the active, dominant partner. But, and this is key, if a freeborn adolescent citizen prostituted himself, acted as a pornos, that was severely stigmatized.
Stigmatized how?
Attic law actually barred such individuals from holding public office or even speaking in the assembly. It shows deep disapproval of a free citizen taking on that passive, commodified role.
So it really highlights how status, age, and role, not sexual preference itself, determined what was okay.
Absolutely. Social status was paramount. The public boyfriend model, its acceptance, was overwhelmingly an aristocratic or free citizen thing. It depended on maintaining those specific social hierarchies and roles. The whole system dictated the terms of engagement.
Okay, so it's embedded in the social structure. But then you get the myths, the stories the Greeks told themselves. And these relationships are all over them, often idealized.
You really are. It's like their foundational stories gave divine and heroic approval, reflecting how deeply this resonated culturally.
Like Zeus and Ganymede.
The classic example. King of the gods, captivated by Ganymede's beauty, whisks him off to Olympus sometimes as an eagle to be his cupbearer, and yes, explicitly his lover.
Can't get much more top-level approval than that.
Right. It normalizes male-male love at the highest cosmic level, makes it a source of divine pleasure, beauty. It wasn't just tolerated in the myth, it was celebrated. Ganymede even gets immortalized as the constellation Aquarius.
And Apollo.
Yeah.
He seems linked to this, too.
Definitely. Apollo, god of so much sun, music, prophecy, is often seen as a patron of same-sex love. He had male lovers like Hyacinthus, the beautiful Spartan prince.
Whose death was tragic, right? The discus accident.
Exactly. And Apollo's grief was so profound, Hyacinthus's blood supposedly turned into the hyacinth flower. Even in tragedy, these myths emphasize the depth of divine love, the powerful emotional connection possible in these bonds. Another lover was Cyparissus, also ending tragically, reinforcing this theme of intense love and loss.
So the gods are doing it. What about the heroes? Achilles and Patroclus come to mind immediately from the Iliad.
A hugely powerful example, their bond. Whether you read it as intense friendship or explicitly erotic love, the devotion is undeniable. Patroclus' death sends Achilles into this absolute spiral of grief and rage.
It drives the whole rest of the story, really.
It does. Homer describes Achilles' mourning as more agonizing than anything else. It shows these bonds as absolutely central to heroic identity, to what motivates a hero. It's the ultimate story of love driving action.
Any others? Heracles.
Heracles, yes. He had a very close relationship with his nephew, Iolaus. Iolaus was his companion in many labors, his charioteer, but many ancient sources and vase paintings depict them as lovers too. It symbolized loyalty, courage, shared struggle, another layer of heroic validation.
So these myths weren't just reflecting society, they were actively shaping it, validating it.
Absolutely. By showing gods and heroes engaged in these relationships, Greek society implicitly normalized and even elevated them. And then you have the art vase paintings showing courtship, athletics, intimate moments, sculptures celebrating the idealized male form. It all underscored the aesthetic and cultural significance, often without any hint of moral judgment. This mythological framework provided a powerful cultural thumbs up for practices like paiderastia.
Okay, so it's in the social structure, it's in the myths, it's in the art. Deeply embedded. But then philosophy enters the chat and things start to get, well, complicated. You start seeing the first intellectual challenges to this acceptance. Plato, for instance, his views seem really complex, even contradictory.
They really are. You look at his earlier or middle dialogues, especially the Symposium. It's this incredible exploration of Eros, of love and desire as a force for virtue, for intellectual growth.
That's the one with all speeches about love.
That's the one. And in it, Plato actually depicts stable, enduring relationships between adult men like Pausanias and Agathon, a respected couple whose relationship went beyond that typical younger, older, pederastic phase.
And Socrates' view in that dialogue.
Socrates, as Plato presents him, champions these mentoring relationships where erotic desire is sort of channeled, sublimated, directed towards pursuing moral virtue, understanding beauty itself, ultimately reaching for the forms. Eros becomes a ladder to philosophical enlightenment.
So in the Symposium, male-male love, if done right, could be noble, even the highest form.
That's certainly the implication for Socrates in that text. The love of a beautiful soul residing in a beautiful male body could be the starting point for the highest philosophical journey.
But then, you get to his later work, The Laws. And it's like a completely different Plato.
It's a stark shift, almost shocking. Decades later, in the Laws, Plato explicitly condemns homosexual acts, calls them utterly unholy, odious to the gods, and ugliest of ugly things. He labels them contrary to nature, even puts them on par with incest.
Wow, what happened? Why the change?
It's debated, but in the Laws, Plato seems much more concerned with social order, stability, and the practicalities of running an ideal state. He connects sexual behavior directly to the health of the soul and the stability of the polis. He argues homosexual intercourse causes evil in the soul and leads to political disorder.
How? What's the link he makes?
His focus shifts much more towards procreation as the primary natural purpose of sex, essential for the continuation of the city. Non-procreative sex starts to be seen as inherently disordered, disrupting the natural, divinely ordained structure of things.
So it's not just a personal moral failing, it's a threat to the state.
That's the argument he makes in the Laws. It's a profound pivot. And it effectively created a philosophical justification rooted in nature and order for condemning these acts, a justification that would have enormous influence down the line. It handed later moralists a powerful intellectual weapon.
Were other philosophers weighing in around this time? What about Xenophon?
Xenophon, another student of Socrates, also wrote a Symposium. In his version, Socrates distinguishes between what he sees as purely transactional sex using catamites for pleasure and genuine, respectable love attachments formed with virtuous individuals. He stresses self-control, avoiding purely physical gratification, focusing on character development, still valuing the relationship, but wary of pure lust.
And Aristotle, Plato's student.
Aristotle's view was incredibly influential, especially for later Western thought. He saw the family unit, specifically man and woman, as the absolute foundation of the state, the irreducible core of a polity. It was essential for procreation, for the very existence of the city.
So for him, it all came back to making babies.
Largely, yes, in terms of the function of sexual relationships within the political structure. He saw chastity as a key political principle. From his viewpoint, any kind of same-sex union that couldn't produce children would be, well, an absurdity in terms of founding or sustaining a polity. His philosophy provided a strong, seemingly rational argument for a procreative, heterosexual norm being essential for society.
So you see this pattern emerging in philosophy. Plato's later work, Aristotle, linking sex tightly to procreation and the good of the polis.
Exactly. And as that link gets stronger, non-procreative acts, including male-male sex, start getting framed as disordered, unnatural, even politically dangerous. The intellectual groundwork for future condemnation is being laid right there, within Greek philosophy itself.
It wasn't just an external thing imposed later then. The seeds were sown earlier.
Absolutely critical point. The decline wasn't sudden. It started with these internal critiques, this growing association of non-procreative sex with unnaturalness and disorder. It provided a philosophical rationale that Rome, and especially Christianity, would later pick up and amplify massively.
Right. And speaking of Rome, the rise of the Roman Empire brought a whole new set of cultural values into play, didn't it? Values that really clashed with the Greek model.
A major clash. Greek culture, as we saw, could idealize eros between free men, especially in that paiderastic context. Roman culture, on the other hand, was built around virtus.
Virtus, manliness, courage.
All that, but more specifically, it was about self-governance, discipline, and crucially, dominance. Maintaining control, especially over social inferiors. It was a kind of conquest mentality, a cult of virility that permeated Roman life.
And how did that apply to sex?
It meant the Roman ideal man always had to be the active, penetrative partner. And ideally, his partner should be socially inferior. Slaves, former slaves, prostitutes, entertainers.
Why inferior partners?
Because penetrating someone of lower status reinforced your dominance, your virtus. Penetrating an equal, or worse, being penetrated was a huge problem for a freeborn Roman citizen.
A huge problem. How did that contrast with the Greek eromenos role?
It's a stark contrast. The Greek eromenos role, being receptive, was a recognized, even valued stage for young, free men. In Rome, for a freeborn citizen to allow himself to be penetrated, to take the passive role that was seen as a direct threat to his libertas, his freedom, his very status as a man, it was deeply shameful, almost like being treated as a slave or a woman.
So who were acceptable male partners for a Roman man, assuming he was the active one?
As I said, usually those of lower status. Slaves, ex-slaves, prostitutes, infames they were called, lacking full citizen rights. Engaging with them sexually didn't compromise the free man's status because the power dynamic was already clear. They were objects, not equals.
And sex with other freeborn men or their families.
Generally considered immoral. especially if it involved taking the passive role. It showed a lack of self-control, an inability to govern oneself, which implied an inability to govern others or participate properly in public life. Roman Virtus fundamentally reframed male-male sex.
So it wasn't necessarily the act itself, but who was doing what to whom and what their statuses were.
Precisely. The Roman system transformed the Greek model. What might have been an honorable mentorship in Greece could become a mark of profound social degradation in Rome if a free man took the passive role. It shifted the focus entirely onto status and dominance. This cultural shift was a major step in eroding the public acceptance seen in Greece.
And you can actually see this difference reflected in their art, can't you?
You can, yeah. It's quite interesting. Greek vase painting, especially from Athens, often shows the eromenos as visually unaroused, and non-penetrative sex, like intercrural sex between the thighs, seems more common in the depictions.
Why might that be?
Well, one theory is that there was a societal reluctance to show the future citizen, the eromenos, deriving pleasure from a female or receptive role. It might compromise his future image as a dominant head of household. The art subtly preserves the ideal of male activity.
But Roman art was different.
Somewhat paradoxically, yes. Roman artists often seem more comfortable depicting mutual affection, desire, and even explicit anal penetration between male figures.
Why the difference, if Romans were so concerned about passivity?
It's likely because the assumed context in Roman art was often that master-slave or superior-inferior dynamic. The Roman man could be shown penetrating because his partner was of lower status, reinforcing, not challenging, his dominance. The Greek art was often navigating the complexities of relationships between potential equals or future equals.
So the art itself tells a story about these shifting anxieties and ideals of masculinity.
Exactly. It shows this gradual process tied to changing social structures rather than some sudden overnight ban. Roman norms didn't eliminate male sex, but they definitely stigmatized certain forms and roles, setting the stage for an even bigger change.
And that bigger change was Christianity.
The decisive shift. The 4th century CE, that's the real turning point. You start seeing the first imperial laws actively punishing men who engage in same-sex acts, or even just appeared effeminate by the new Christian Roman standards. These laws came directly from Christian emperors.
And this is where influential figures, the church fathers, come in, like Augustine.
Augustine of Hippo, hugely influential. Despite, interestingly, writing about his own intense male friendships and yearful sex life, he later became a cornerstone of Christian condemnation.
How so? What did he argue?
In his famous work, City of God, he flat out condemned all same-sex relations. He famously linked male-male sex directly to Sodom and Gomorrah, calling it an unnatural vice. That interpretation stuck, and sodomite became the dominant, terrifying term for centuries, implying divine wrath.
He saw it as violating God's order.
Yes. He argued it polluted the spring water of friendship with the filth of concupiscence and violated the natural divine order oriented towards procreation within marriage.
Yeah, and John Chrysostom. He was even more vocal, wasn't he?
Incredibly fervent, probably the most actively homophobic of the early church fathers. He became Patriarch of Constantinople and just relentlessly preached against male love, called it monstrous, execrable, a new, and lawless lust.
Why such intensity? What was his fear?
He saw it as a profound threat. Not just individual sin, but a danger to society, to gender roles, to creation itself. He famously worried that womankind is in danger of being superfluous if men took each other as partners. He framed it as a social plague, a terrible and incurable disease that subverted natural law and deserved the harshest punishment. His rhetoric was incredibly powerful and shaped popular opinion for ages.
And this wasn't happening in a vacuum, right? It tied into suppressing paganism.
Absolutely. Early Christian leaders wanted to clearly distinguish their faith from pagan practices, which they often painted as morally lax, involving free sexuality or gender-bending priests like the Galli. So, recasting male-male relationships as sins against nature and crimes against God was part of establishing a distinct, stricter Christian morality. It created a powerful moral panic, demonizing these relationships in a totally new way.
So it wasn't just disapproval, it was demonization, transforming it from a social issue into a profound spiritual and moral failing.
Exactly. And this theological condemnation quickly became state policy, state persecution. Under Constantine and his successors, stamping out paganism and homosexuality went hand in hand, part of building a Christian empire.
What did the actual laws say? How severe were they?
They became progressively harsher. In 342 CE, Constantine's sons issued a law targeting passive partners and effeminate men. The punishment, exquisite punishment, Scholars generally agree this meant the death penalty, possibly burning or castration. Unprecedented.
Then Theodosius.
In 390 CE, Emperor Theodosius I reinforced the bans, explicitly quoting the Old Testament condemnations from Leviticus. Initially, it seemed focused on male prostitutes, but the direction was clear.
And the Theodosian Code.
Compiled in 438 CE, it codified all the laws since Constantine. It explicitly condemned all passive males involved in same-sex acts to death by burning, a horrific penalty later expanded to include the act of partners too. The act itself became a capital crime, regardless of role.
And Justinian took it even further.
Justinian's code, from 534 CE, was hugely influential on later European law. His laws, like Novella 77 and 141, explicitly linked gay acts to God's wrath. He warned they caused famine, earthquake, and pestilence, the destruction of cities.
So they blamed natural disasters on gay people.
They often did. Laws against same-sex acts were frequently enacted or reissued right after earthquakes or plagues, framing them as divine punishment. The public executions, often by burning, were presented as necessary sacrifices to appease God and cleanse society. Terrifying spectacles.
That's a clear, horrifying line, isn't it? Theology becomes law, becomes state terror.
Absolutely. The increasing severity, the expansion of who was targeted, it effectively forced male-male relationships entirely out of the public sphere, deep underground. This legal framework, driven by Christian morality, is what truly sealed the fate of the Greek public boyfriend model.
So recapping this whole loss, it wasn't sudden. It was a long trajectory.
A very long, multifaceted trajectory. Started with that nuanced acceptance in Greece tied to education, military, social status.
Then eroded by Roman Virtus ideals, which stigmatized passivity for free men, making it about dominance and shame.
Creating a vulnerability, exactly. And then the decisive blow. Christianity's theological framework deeming all non-procreative sex, especially male-male sex, as inherently unnatural, sinful, immortal sin.
Shifting it from a social status issue to a moral theological one.
A fundamental shift. No longer about your role or age, but about your eternal soul, about divine judgment.
And this got baked into law across medieval Europe.
Deeply. By the 11th century, sodomy wasn't just a sin, it was a serious crime, often linked with heresy. Punishments were brutal mutilation, burning, hanging.
Thomas Aquinas reinforced this?
Yes, in the 13th century. Aquinas, the great scholastic theologian, linked homosexuality to his concept of natural law. He called it a vice against nature, second only to bestiality and its wrongness. His arguments provided a powerful, systematic, philosophical, and theological justification for the legal bans.
And these laws spread.
Pretty much everywhere. Most civil codes across Europe adopted severe punishments, heavily influenced by church teaching and Roman law precedents like Justinian's. A key example is England's Buggery Act of 1533.
Henry VIII seems ironic.
It does, but he enacted it. Death penalty for sodomy by hanging. And that law stood as a precedent for centuries in England and its colonies. It was only fully repealed in the mid-19th century.
So the disappearance of that Greek model, it was this complex pileup of factors.
Exactly. Shifting power, changing ideologies, Roman patriarchy, philosophical critiques, Christian dogma, state laws, all working together over centuries to drive these relationships underground, transforming them from public and sometimes honored to hidden, criminal, and deeply shameful.
Which brings us finally to how we try to understand all this today, modern scholarship. And the huge challenge of anachronism applying our terms like gay or straight, where they just don't fit.
A massive challenge. And modern scholarship is still debating how best to interpret ancient sexualities. You basically have two broad camps. Essentialists on one side, who tend to see universal, timeless patterns of same-sex attraction. They might suggest that ancient Greek men who loved other men were experiencing something fundamentally akin to modern gay identity.
And the other side.
Social constructionists. They argue that sexual preferences and identities are shaped by specific societies and historical contexts. They'd say there's no direct equivalence between ancient paiderastia and modern gay identity. For them, categories like status, role, age were far more important to the ancients than our idea of sexual orientation. Some even argue sexual preference wasn't really a meaningful category for them at all.
But it's not necessarily that black and white.
No, and scholars like Thomas Hubbard argue for more nuance. He suggests that if you look closely at the texts, you do find hints that certain sexual preferences were seen as distinguishing characteristics, maybe even inborn qualities, aspects of someone's core identity, even back then. So the debate continues.
And even classic works are being reevaluated, like Kenneth Dover's book.
Dover's Greek homosexuality from 1978 was groundbreaking, absolutely essential. But now it's critiqued for maybe focusing too much on power dynamics and anal penetration, potentially influenced by the biases of his own time.
How so?
Critics argue he might have downplayed other forms of intimacy or affection, and perhaps overstated the idea that any passive role automatically meant shame or effeminacy, especially for the eromenos. More recent work suggests the reality was probably more complex, with a wider range of acceptable expressions.
Like those adult relationships in Plato's Symposium.
Exactly. The seemingly casual acceptance of the relationship between Agathon and Pausanias in that dialogue suggests that long-term adult male couples weren't necessarily seen as perverse or shocking in Athens, challenging the idea that all such relationships were stigmatized.
So the key takeaway for us trying to understand this history is
Avoid anachronism like the plague. Using terms like straight men or gay men for ancient Greeks is misleading. We have to grapple with the primary sources, critique our own modern frameworks, and try to reconstruct their social structures, their ways of understanding, rather than just imposing ours.
listen to the past on its own terms.
Precisely. It's the only way to get a truly nuanced historical picture, to appreciate how unique their systems were, how different their norms, and how dramatically things changed over time. It reminds you that what we consider normal is always a product of a specific time and place.
What an incredible, complex journey from this institutionalized, sometimes celebrated thing in Greece tied to education, military status, then shifting under Rome's ideas of masculinity, and finally being condemned, criminalized, driven underground by early Christianity.
It truly was a profound, slow, multifaceted transformation. Social norms, philosophy, imperial power, religious doctrine, all interwoven. Not one single cause, but this intricate web leading to the loss of that public visibility, that acceptance.
It leaves you wondering, doesn't it? What does this whole story tell us about our own ideas? About masculinity, intimacy, friendship, the possibilities of human connection. What might male friendship or any friendship look like today if we weren't burdened by some of these historical fears about intimacy, about beauty, maybe?
That's the provocative thought, isn't it? Looking at this deep history offers a fascinating, maybe unsettling lens on our own time. What was lost? And could any of that capacity for certain kinds of closeness, stripped of the problematic power dynamics, perhaps be recovered? Something to think about.